Awesome. So let's get started. Thank you everybody for joining today's webinar hosted by Zoe Financial. I'm going to begin by reading a brief disclosure. This presentation is not to be taken as investment advice and should not be relied on for such advice or as a substitute for consultation with professional accounting, tax, legal, or financial advisors. The observations made are independent of Zoe Financial and should not be read as financial recommendations. So you're probably wondering, how does Zoe help you? And what we do here at Zoe is essentially help you grow your wealth. We know that growing your wealth is really tough, and Zoe makes it easy by connecting you to the very top 5% of advisors in the country, as well as then making it a seamless, frictionless process to find, hire, work, and ultimately invest with a financial advisor. So that's what we do. But let's get into why you're here, right? We want to talk about how you can secure your dream lifestyle. And a huge part of that in retirement is ultimately your retirement income. So I'll begin by introducing Andres and then our wonderful expert, who is one of those top 5% of advisors that I mentioned. So to begin, your host for today will be Andres Garcia-Amaya. He is a CFA, CEO, and founder. Prior to founding Zoe Financial, Andres was an executive director at JP Morgan Asset Management. There, he helped oversee over $300 billion in assets. He is a CFA charter holder. He obtained an MBA from the Wharton School at UPenn, during which he received the Joseph Wharton Fellowship for Outstanding Record of Academic Achievement and the Toigo Foundation Fellowship. With you, Andres.
Great. Thank you so much, Ali, for the intro. You can hear me okay? All right. So actually, right before I introduce Veronica here, I want to thank the marketing team, especially Isa and Ali, who made this webinar happen and makes all the presentations look so great. So thank you so much for all your hard work. Okay, so let's start by making an intro here of Veronica Caras. So Veronica is a senior financial advisor with CapTrust. CapTrust is the largest RIA in the country. She previously worked as a financial planner at FC Group. She also worked at Merrill Lynch Global Wealth Management Division. Prior to that, as Circle Advisors. She has extensive experience working with high net worth individuals and small business owners. She holds an MBA from the Leuven School of Business. She's also the author of the Money Matters series of books and a national speaker for financial literacy. Veronica, we're just so excited to have you with us today. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Andres. I'm so excited to be here. It's my honor and my pleasure. And your team has just been exceptional. So I'll echo your sentiments. It's been a pleasure to work with Izzy and Ali. So thank you.
Awesome. All right. So let's get going here. And before we get going on each independent topic, I just wanted to give an agenda of what we're going to be covering. So first, we're going to talk about spending during retirement and the different types of spending that people have. We'll talk about retirement income sources, and then we're going to cover the frameworks used to generate income during retirement. Lastly, we'll talk about the different ways you could implement those frameworks, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So let's just get started to make sure that we leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I know that is, for a lot of people, one of the favorite parts that they get to ask their specific questions. Before we get going on discussing spending during retirement, I wanted to start with this slide to kind of anchor us on understanding why we're talking about, saving versus spending, or how to allocate your assets, rather than, for instance, the economic environment or what the market's going to do this year. And the reason is, when you look at this chart, if you start on the left, these are items, right? Or these are different aspects of that affect your retirement that you have no control. The more you go to the left, the less control you have over it, right? Like, we don't have a control of what economic growth will do this year, or what inflation will do this year. Like, very little, right? Zero, outside of voting, right? Policy decisions will be made regarding what you talk about with your friends and family on this topic. Market returns, We wish we had a crystal ball, but we don't, right? We have no control what the market is going to do this year. Longevity, you have more control, but not all control, right? Maybe you could eat healthy, you could sleep better, right? Next in line, employment earnings and duration of employment. You have more control, right? You could maybe study what an area that you believe will give you great employment earnings. And if you play your cards right, maybe you have a long career, right? So you have more control over that. And then if you go all the way to the right, you have a lot more control how you allocate your investments and in which accounts you allocate those investments. Lastly, you have a lot more control of how much you save versus how much you spend, right? So the reason we're focused on a lot of the topics that are on the right side of this is that ultimately those are the ones that you have more control over. Surprisingly, as human beings, we're constantly worrying about what's on the left side of the screen, yet we have no control over it. Right. So this webinar is trying to focus on the ones that we do have control. And what we find is that it does empower you to make better decisions once you kind of make that shift in your mindset of like, wow, these are actual things that we could do ourselves or with a great advisor like Veronica. So using that framework to get us started, let's start now, Veronica, maybe just on the topic of spending during retirement. Right, you have a lot of different clients that are either at the cusp of retirement, already retired, and for people that are maybe earlier in their journey, I think it's really interesting to hear how you think about spending during retirement and the type of conversations you have with clients. So maybe we'll start with non-discretionary spending.
Yeah, thank you, Andres. And so one of the things I think that's a myth a little bit is that you're going to spend less in retirement than you do now because maybe you won't have commute expenses or lunch expenses or other things. We have actually found, especially for people who tend to retire early, and especially those who retire young and healthy, I'll say, they actually tend to spend more when they first retire, right? You know, retirement is just more time to spend more money, right? You're replacing those times in your day that you spent at work with, you know, going out and spending it some way, somehow, whether that's a golf club or travel or maybe community charitable work, so on and so forth. Everyone's got their thing, but it's more time to spend more money. So I think the first thing to focus on are the things you absolutely need to be able to afford. So taxes is one. You know, any debt that you have, you want to pay it off, like your mortgage and things like that. Utility bills, you know, you always want to make sure the lights are on in your house and the refrigerator's working. Living expenses, you know, food, clothing. There are things you want to make sure that you definitely have the money for, and of course, insurance and healthcare as you're in retirement as well. The second bucket of expenses are really the ones we have full control over. There are lifestyle expenses. We get to decide exactly how much we want to go into this area. And I would say, you know, if there were periods of time where you really were overspending in some areas, it's typically in the discretionary spending areas, you know, the travel, luxuries, hobbies, legacies. You know, I have a client now who came to us. When he first came to us, he was like, I just can't figure out why I can't make my budget work. You know, he had 6 country club memberships in 3 different states where he was traveling to, right? You know, there are people who really, you know, you get creative about how you spend your money if you really want to. And it's really, really easy to find ways to spend money. So the discretionary spending are usually the ones where we have those big conversations around what really needs to shift. Can you cut down to just 2 country clubs, for instance?
Yeah, and I think I imagine a lot of the conversations is also trying to figure out which ones within the discretionary spending bucket for that person might not be discretionary, right?
Yeah.
Meaning, hey, I am not going to not have a legacy, right? Like that's not discretionary. Everything else, hey, we could discuss. So it's kind of this figuring that part out, which is obviously a very personal type of decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also realizing, you know, there's an interesting category here, legacy, right? the money we spend now, the money you spend traveling or on the country club memberships, for instance, is you don't get to leave behind to your children. So part of this is also prioritizing where you want your money to go. If you want to spend down to your last penny by the end of your life, which is hard to predict when that will be, by the way, and I would tell you that death is not a great financial plan. You want to make sure you balance that with the goal to leave money behind if that's one of yours, or charitable goals or anything else. So it's important to keep all of these things in mind. And usually for most people, they have a rank order. You know, for the first 10 years, I really want to focus on traveling. But, you know, I don't need to buy, you know, luxury leather goods or something like that. And they tend to change over time.
Perfect. All right. So that's on the spending side. And I'm sure you could spend a lot of time on the individual level discussing these things and really trying to hone in which are the ones that are really, really discretionary, like 6 memberships. But let's talk a little bit more on the retirement income sources, because I feel like this is an area where a lot of people have a misconception, as well as which sources are actually the ones that are stable and important. So let's jump into to discussing these.
Yeah, you know, along with being stable and important, I would say not all income sources are created equal, right? And what I mean by that is, so I think a lot of people don't realize, for instance, how much Social Security is, right? So like these days, if you delay taking Social Security and you've contributed the full amount each year and you're entitled to the max, you know, that's $45,000 worth of income per person, might be a little bit more these days. That's a huge chunk. But what's really important to keep in mind about Social Security is actually it's cost of living adjusted, right? We saw the numbers go up huge amounts of last year because of that. And you have to remember that, you know, your expenses are cost of living adjusted too, right? They inflate over time. So to know which sources are going to keep pace with inflation is super important too. I'll contrast that with, it's very common that pensions, while they're great, are not cost of living adjusted. So maybe the $3,000 a month or so that you're entitled to now, it's going to be $3,000 a month when you're 90 years old, 30 years from now, but it's not going to have the same spending
Right.
power.
$3,000 won't be the same 20, 30 years from now.
Exactly. And, you know, that's a reason why it's also really important to have balanced portfolios. You know, it's not just about the market returns and what it'll do, but stocks in their own way over a long period of time are really a hedge against inflation because they're going to grow more. Similar with, you know, bonds are a hedge against market downturns. So it's important to have balanced portfolios so that you can sustain those income sources. Annuities are another one. They come in a variety of flavors. They have some tax implications too. So it's important to know how annuities are owned and held. And we'll talk a little bit later, but you know, annuities are great vehicles in some ways, and in other ways, really not great vehicles. And MLPs and REITs, that's an interesting one because that they tend to be, from an investment perspective, really not that tax friendly, right? So where you own those products at that location, not allocation, becomes really, really important.
Yeah, that's a key part that I think a lot of people miss, is not just about, you know, creating the right recipe with the ingredients, right? But it's like, you can't mix those ingredients ahead of time, or you might end up with a dish that you don't want, right? If you put MLPs and REITs in a taxable account, you're going to get a lot of taxes. Moving it into a non-taxable account, all of a sudden now they become a lot more more beneficial to your portfolio. So those are all, I think, interesting and important topics to discuss as you're trying to build that portfolio. I'll tell you that the Social Security one is one that's often missed, even for people that have, you know, $5-10 million. They think of Social Security as like not relevant. It's like, no, that's $80,000 a year, $70,000 a year. That's coming in. So it's not irrelevant, even if it covers just the country club, right? Like it's still relevant. So all these are important to kind of keep an eye on and understand that it's not one or the other, but most likely, you know, a mix of all of those.
Yeah.
All right. So let's switch gears from the different types of sources to the frameworks. right? And actually, I think this case study goes hand in hand with the sources. I take that back. It's a good way of explaining how income sources could kind of fit the bill. So maybe I'll let you take it away here on explaining this $2 million portfolio.
Yeah, so, if you take a $2 million portfolio, you want to start thinking about, or any size portfolio really, how much can I withdraw from that portfolio to sustain my lifestyle and not run out of money? That's the goal here in all of this. So let's say, this is just an example. Let's say your lifestyle expenses, your non-discretionary and discretionary all come to, I know this is a really, really specific number, $131,840. And you're like, okay, where is that money going to come from? So, maybe the husband's Social Security is $37,944 and the wife's Social Security is $34,000. Well, now you have $72,216 of it covered. So you don't need all $131,000 out of your portfolio, and you don't need to structure your portfolio for that. What you need to structure your portfolio for is the $59,624 in today's dollars, of course, that you will plan to withdraw from it. And so that's really, it's just important to know the numbers, because a lot of times people are like, I only have a $2 million portfolio. I can't afford a $131,000 lifestyle. But actually, when you start putting in the income sources and where the money is coming from, they really can. Like, it is okay if you're 65 to take out almost $60,000 a year from your portfolio, especially because, like we said, Social Security will actually adjust for inflation and it'll help you keep pace with those income needs.
Right. And then even from that 59.6, you might be able to take a big chunk just through the income that your bond portfolio or even your stock portfolio, your dividends could give you, right? So in essence, like, you might not need to sell as much as you think you do once you start breaking up into different pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. And it's super important to know what needs to come from principal. Like, you actually need to sell something and maybe realize a gain, or even, as someone heads into age 73 now, they'll have required minimum distributions coming in.
Right.
And, maybe some of that is automatically coming. And that's also really important to plan for too. The $2 million, if it's in a retirement account, is not really worth $2 million if it be, taxed. So it's important to know exactly where your money is and what it's doing.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's now move on to the retirement income frameworks. And there's three, and we're going to go through each of these, correct?
Yes, that is correct. So this is just a way we think about money when we think about creating a cash flow plan for our clients. So the first is your liquidity bucket, which we'll talk about. And that'll be your most conservative liquid assets, exactly what it sounds like. Then the next is your income bucket. And your income bucket is what's actually going to fuel your liquidity bucket. It's what's income generating that's going to generate the cash that you need to support your lifestyle. And then you have your growth bucket, because as we talked about, you really need those cost of living adjustments or anything that's going to, keep pace and outpace inflation for over the long term, so that you don't outlive your money. The focus here is you don't want a lot of years left at the end of your money. You want it the other way around.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start here with the liquid bucket, as you mentioned, the most conservative one.
Yeah, so this really has 2 years worth of expenses. That's why we always start with expenses. In order to know how to fund your buckets, you need to know what they need to be funded with. So it's 2 years worth of your expenses or the withdrawals you need from your portfolio in cash. These are easily accessible in liquid vehicles, cash, money market, treasury bills, laddered CDs, let's say laddered treasury bills as well. Something that's gonna be really liquid and accessible, and you can time it and doesn't carry with it market risk. So the value will stay the value. It'll be exactly what you expect. And we do 2 years primarily, to deal with market downturns and things like that. 2 years is a good amount of time to have conservative and liquid as you head into retirement. Of course, if you're, in the earlier stages of your career, you don't need as much liquidity because you have an income flow.
Right. And I think what's interesting about this liquid bucket is that you would think that you don't need to revisit that often, but think about last year heading into this year, where a CD was yielding less than 1%, and now you got CDs yielding you 4 or 5, 4.5%. So things have definitely changed in the sense of what you could do in the sense of getting income within the liquid bucket versus in years past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to the second bucket here, the income bucket.
Yeah, so the income bucket, I would say is if you're thinking about risk on a ladder, whereas the liquid bucket is the most conservative, your income bucket would still be not volatile, but maybe a little bit more risky in that sense. So this is where, depending on someone's risk tolerance, we have 7 to 10 years worth of expenses. So if somebody, maybe has a pension or has other income sources, we'd be a little bit closer to the 7-year side. But if they're really relying on their portfolio, we're closer to the 10-year side on the income bucket. And that's income producing relatively low risk investments. I tell everyone it's a good way to think about the differences you have in stock types. It's really different to buy a Facebook stock versus a Johnson & Johnson stock, right? That intuitively feels different. But in financial terms, it's also one is going to pay you a dividend and the other one is going to fluctuate a little bit more. And this really includes also municipal bonds, corporate bonds, treasury notes. So they got a little bit long-term, annuities, rental properties, all of that, those types of income generating assets will go into the income bucket. And the income from this bucket is actually going to be rolled into the liquidity bucket. So it's actually how you fund the first bucket. And the key here is doing it as tax efficiently as possible, right? Municipal bonds are a great way to do that. Annuities can be a great way to do that. Corporate bonds usually in tax deferred accounts are also a great way to do that. And treasury notes, of course, too, because they have tax advantages as well. So the key here is making the income as tax efficient as possible.
Great. And then the last bucket here is the growth bucket.
Right. And so your growth bucket is where people mostly take their risk, right? It's your higher standard deviation type assets, the market, et cetera. It's growth focused. It's where over a long term you expect to make the greatest percentage return, I'll say. It includes stocks, REITs, MLPs, hedge funds, private equity. If you're a business owner, it includes your business. You can expect these to grow substantially over time. It helps counteract inflation. And of course, the growth in that, as you take your profits off the table over time, which is why rebalancing is so important. As you make your profits, you have to take some risk off the table. The profits actually will pour into the income bucket to help fund that on an ongoing basis. And the liquidity bucket, of course, pays for your income expenses, but you can think of your growth bucket as being really the one to fund your longer term expenses past 10 years. When you think 20 years from now, where's the cash going to come from? Well, it's going to come from the growth of these assets and investments.
Yeah, I would say that especially last year, when people called, or filled out the form to find an advisor, a big concern is that if they were doing this themselves or with someone that really didn't kind of have this type of framework helping them, people were starting to pull money during retirement from their only bucket, which was like the stock market or bond market. And both stocks and bonds were down 17% last year, right? So really important to have those separate buckets. So in a year like last year, you could have not have to worry about your growth bucket being down significantly because you weren't drawing from it, right? You were drawing from your liquidity bucket, which wasn't affected by what was going on in the markets. So I think this is like super relevant to what happened last year and, what could happen this year.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, the thing with keeping your investments in mind a little bit, the growth bucket is, it doesn't mean that every year the assets will go up.
Right.
Over 10 years, over 20 years, they will go up. And we know that to be true in all market conditions, and so that's really the focus of the growth bucket, is not the immediate term. It's always good to think about that. Like, will in 10 years, will the market be higher than it is today? Yeah, we can confidently say that it will.
Absolutely. Going back to that, you don't have control of what's going to happen in the markets this week, this month, this year. But we could say with fair confidence that 10 years out, stocks and bonds will be okay, right? It's just in the short term that, anything goes. There's really no crystal ball.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right. So these are the buckets. Let's talk a little bit about how you could actually implement this strategy. What are some of the vehicles, if you will, that you could implement this? So let's start with target date funds.
Yeah, so target date funds are really for the investor that like doesn't want to be going into their accounts and moving money around and thinking about, okay, my growth bucket generated XYZ growth. I can move that, 8% into the income bucket and then that cash into the liquid bucket. If you don't want to be the manager of your buckets and you don't have a financial advisor, target date funds sort of automatically rebalance as you get closer to retirement. So they simplify this process for you and they stay diversified. So let's say, you were going into the workforce and you have 30 years left from today. Well, you would choose the bucket that's closest to like 2053, right? It's probably going to be 2050 or 2055, but you would choose that bucket that's closest to it. And it would just get more conservative over time as you got closer to retirement. And that helps you sort of reduce the ups and downs of, or what we call volatility of a portfolio as you need more liquidity. So it's kind of an automatic way to do that.
Yeah. And what I would say about target date funds is that they're not all created equal, right? There's some, for instance, that let's say that 2050 is the end date of the portfolio. It might have already get you like a lot more conservative at 2050 versus others kind of have a drift to get you to conservative over the following 5 to 10 years. Like they're all not the same, right? So something to keep in mind as well is to kind of read a little bit of the fine print of how they're going about it to make sure that you're not surprised once you get to the end date of that or the target date of that portfolio.
Yes, absolutely. It's important to look at what you're invested in regularly. They're all published. So you can always like look up the ticker, look up the name and see exactly what the breakdown is for sure.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say on target date funds is also their fees are not created equal. There's some that are literally 3 times more expensive than others and do exactly the same thing. So, so look at the fees and make sure that, you're not just kind of buying something that just happens to kind of get in front of you first, and you end up paying, 2-3 times the fees that you would another one. All right, cool. So let's talk a little bit about target risk portfolio strategies.
Yeah, so target risk portfolio strategies are sort of an automatic way to create an allocation based on risk, right? So rather than saying, I want to be conservative by XYZ date, you can say, I want to be a moderate investor all the time, right? Maybe that means a 50-50 portfolio. And so rather than targeting, a specific date or even a specific number, you just say, I always want to be balanced. And what that does is that the portfolio manager who runs these target risk portfolios will constantly rebalance and reallocate to that, 50-50 target. And that's sort of the easiest way to think about it. It's also an easy way to diversify and also keep your allocation the same through time, which may be appropriate. And you can always change the target risk. So if you're in your 20s, you want to be more aggressive, and then, you're in your mid 50s and you want to be more conservative, just change the target risk.
Absolutely. I know that this is something that this strategy was created for institutional portfolios, 50 years ago. And over time, this institutional knowledge has been passed on to more of like high net worth individuals. So it's, having worked as a institutional portfolio manager, that is how, in my opinion, the right way of thinking about it is often just hard for the average, a person that's not really interested in kind of doing this on an everyday basis to think about it that way. But first, understanding risk and targeting risk opposed to returns is definitely, let's put it this way, more achievable in the long term than trying to, target a particular return profile year over year. Very hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that is the part of the presentation that we talk about the retirement landscape and the frameworks, as well as the implementation of those frameworks. Before we turn it to Q&A, I would love to hear from you, Veronica, as to why you became a financial advisor. A little bit about yourself would be awesome.
Thank you, Andres. Yeah, so, we talked about this. I have a very clear reason I became a financial advisor, which can be looked at as terrible, but I actually think it's a good thing now. So my family came here as refugee immigrants in the early 90s. And at some point, my grandfather, who ran a mental institution in his prior life, was able to bring some money over to the United States. He went into a local branch bank because he didn't know where to go. And, he spoke to the only Russian-speaking advisor there. And the person there, sold him 9 annuities across a small number of assets, and they were terrible products. Like, you're talking about something that had like a guaranteed 1% return and 2% fees or something like that. So you're losing money the whole way through. And, when I was a little bit older, my grandfather asked me to take a look at what he has going on. And I was in high school. I had just been working since I was 14 years old. And he was like, you pay taxes, maybe you understand this. So I took it to a social studies teacher, and he kind of walked me through what happened. And it became really clear, my grandfather was really taken advantage of for his lack of knowledge of the financial system. And I got really angry. That's like the New Yorker in me. I got really angry about it. I was like, I'm gonna, put all these bad advisors in jail. And I was committed to becoming an attorney. But my grandfather has always been the eternal optimist. He's climbed Mount Everest, and he's just lived an amazing life. Still does, and fortunately. And he was like, maybe you could just, rather than like being so angry about it and committing to putting people in jail, maybe you could be the person that helps other people not have to go through this. And so, it became a different mission for me. And, I really take care of every single client. I mean this, like their family. Everybody is someone's grandfather, father, mother, sister, daughter. And, for me, it's if I can help one person, I've been really fortunate to help many, but if I could help one person, one family not have to go through that. My grandfather worked until he was 82 years old because his money didn't grow the way it was supposed to. It wasn't done right. He didn't get good advice. If I can help one person not have to go through that, that's all. That's part, like, it's everything to me. It's literally everything to me.
Thanks for sharing that. That's such a cool story. And one of the reasons we want to include it is that I think it shines through as you're explaining it, how genuine your mission on this is. So thanks so much for sharing that.
I appreciate that. It's also made me keenly aware of the differences between fiduciary advisors and product salespeople, by the way.
Don't get me started. I mean, that's literally why we started Zoe. Maybe this is a good transition, right? To talk a little bit about that is I worked at large banks prior to starting the company, and I just could not believe, once they saw how the sausage was made, I could not believe what they got away with, essentially. And the best analogy I have is the equivalent in our industry, is the equivalent of in healthcare, where there is doctors and then there's pharma sales reps, right? But they're clearly different people. Like the pharma sales reps are not allowed to put on a white coat and say, well, I'm now your doctor and I'm going to recommend this product that I'm selling, right? But that's literally what happens in our industry. And once they kind of understood how it worked, I'm like, similar to you, I was just pissed off. I'm like, there's got to be a way to help people find the doctor, if you will, right? The advisor that could actually provide advice, not trying to sell you a product. And that's why we're very, very selective of the advisors that are in our network, including yourself, because as you can tell, people that are listening, how passionate she is about the same thing. So I already saw a couple of questions come through on this topic, so might as well hit it right away, which people are saying, hey, how do I find Veronica? How do I find an advisor like Veronica? You could either call 646-680-9244. You could go to our website, zoefin.com, and fill out a quick questionnaire to make sure that we're matching you with the right type of advisor, depending on what you're looking for. Or you could email us at concierge@zoefin.com. This is literally what we do for a living, right? So if that's of interest, that is how to go about it.